Assalamualaikum and hello everyone. Welcome to National Conference on Behavioral Insights 2021 with the theme Spearheading Efficient Public Policy Delivery. And welcome to the session as I'm the moderator, Elise. And for the session, the topic will be Getting Policy Right, Why We Should Nudge Behaviors by Mr. Eddie Razak. And before that, let me introduce our speaker. Mr. Eddie Raza is Senior Advisor at Eden Strategy Institute, a strategy and innovation consulting firm based in Singapore. And among his consulting roles is providing advisory to the Ministry of Human Resource and Social Development of Saudi Arabia for over a year. He also serves on the board of various operating companies in Malaysia of Hatton Land, a company listed on the Singapore Stock Exchange. He was formerly Executive Vice President at National Innovation Agency under the Malaysia government. And before that, he was the inaugural CEO of the Malaysian Investor Relations Association that was set up for capital market development by Bursa Malaysia Stock Exchange and Securities Commission Malaysia. Prior to that, AD was the two public listed companies, namely JPK Holdings as Finance Director and DPS Resources as Group Corporate Advisor. AD has held a number of roles in corporate finance, investor relations, and financial accounting, including in oil and gas with Shell, in regional telecommunications infrastructure with Lucent Technologies, and investment banking with MIMB. AD holds a Master in Public Management degree from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore and US. He had served an attachment with the Smart Nation and Digital Government Office of the Prime Minister's Office in Singapore and was a Lee Kuan Yew Fellow at John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He is the current president of Malaysia Alumni of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And Mr. Eddie did his undergraduate studies at the University of Maryland in the United States, where he obtained 2 Bachelor of Science degrees, one in finance and one in management science and statistics. Eddie also holds a certificate in investor relations from the United Kingdom. He also does voluntary work in education, serving on school boards and driving education initiatives. And without further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Eddie Razak to give his presentation on getting policy right, why we should nudge behaviors. Mr. Eddie?
Thank you, Dr. Ili. And wow, that is a very generous introduction. Thank you so much. And also thank you to MPC for inviting me to present at this seminar. Now we've got a lot to cover, so let's get right to it. Now the theme today is getting policy right, why we should nudge behaviors. So first of all, maybe I spend a bit of time for us to look at policy, have an understanding of what does it mean, to get policy right. So let's move on. So, governments, of course, as you know, use policies to drive the economy, and why? For the benefit of society. But quite often, even though the intentions are good, people don't behave in the way that you expect to. So in the traditional way of looking at economics models and the new way, we find that, if you don't take into account people's behaviors, sometimes these models don't work. You may have, the intention is good, you give them good choices, right? But people sometimes they want to choose the things which are not so good, So that is very important for us to understand why why behaviors play a part in policy making. Now, maybe we look a bit deeper and we think about, how in traditional economics, there are various policy tools, such as pricing. For example, government sets prices, sets rates and all that, tariffs and all that. There are incentives and penalties. Government provides rewards or grants or subsidies, allocation. In fact, you can say tax or tax allowance or tax penalties are also incentives and penalties, but I put them as pricing. But government also, engages in providing the right information. So the idea behind this is that if you give the right price with the right incentives, with the full information, the good information, the public will all respond in their best interest. Everybody will respond, to get the best interest for themselves, and therefore you get good policy outcomes, which brings benefit to the society. But however, quite often the human behavior conflicts with those policies, and that leads to a kind of a failure of those policies, right? So, if you think I do this illustration on the right, if you think of it like, turning the tap, right? Turning a tap, whether to provide the right pricing, the right incentives or penalties or information. So when the policies don't work so well, sometimes we turn the tap even more, to provide more better pricing or add pricing or lower pricing or add incentives, right? But that is wasteful. And quite often it still fails because it doesn't take into account something, which is behaviors. So if I can ask the audience, have you heard of people, sometimes lamenting, especially you as policymakers, like the lament is that the government has introduced so many things, provided so many things. For instance, for the government provides, a community hall, but it's underutilized, things like that. Huh? And the blame is on the people's mindset. But the question is, what is the people's mindset? What is it? So it's not to say either party is wrong, but it's to say that it is important that we need to understand the role of behaviors in policy making. So now let's distinguish between the way that we look at traditional economics and the way that we look at economics, which includes behavioral insights. So notice I think you'll be drawn to the two pictures, right? In traditional economics, the assumption is that people are more like Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett, right? The rich, the greatest investor. He reads the stock papers. He does all his very solid analysis, and he makes the best decisions. But in reality, people are a bit more like Donald Trump. A little bit irrational, a little bit erratic. Now, I'm not saying that we are like Donald Trump because he has other negative behaviors, like, maybe he's not so ethical, for example, right? But what I'm saying is that people are neither too systematic, right, or too irrational. They are really somewhere in between. But I hope these pictures help you to visualize. Sometimes what I like to do is I like to give extreme examples. The point is not to say that one is like this or one is like that, but an extreme example helps you to understand the concept a little better. So, for example, in traditional economics, the assumption is that human beings are very rational. They make decisions based on logic and the right information, full information. And then they do want to maximize their own utility. When I say maximize utility, means you want to get the most benefit, like Warren Buffett, right? The best outcomes for your investment. And you make the decision based on that. But in reality, human beings are not entirely rational. They're not irrational, mind you. It's not that they are crazy or anything. It is not entirely rational because they're influenced by the environment they're in, the various emotional states they're in, the various social networks, not networks that they have, their community, etc. Right? But the interesting thing about this is that although humans are irrational, they are predictably irrational. So this is interesting. They are systematically irrational. So when you think about it, Donald Trump may be seen to be irrational, but you can, in a way, predict how irrational he's going to be. Anyway, that's just to stretch the thought further so that you can distinguish between the two. Yeah. So now, when I say humans are irrational, what is the reason for that? That is because the human thought process, a lot of it is based on biases. Because, for instance, if you're a male, you have a certain kind of bias. You have a female, you have a certain kind of bias. If you live in a certain part of the country, you have this kind of bias. You live somewhere else, you have another bias. Or let's say your age group also, you have different biases on what you're exposed to. You have your own biases. And also you make decisions, humans make decisions based on heuristics. What are heuristics? Heuristics In Malay, it's agak-agak, something like that. And, rule of thumb, you use rule of thumb to agak-agak, or your mental shortcuts, uh, or you think in terms of analogy. For example, if your neighbor, does not, your uncle, neighbor, he's quite old, he doesn't buy insurance and he's healthy, you assume that you also are like that, and you think you don't need to buy insurance. So, you don't do the best things for yourself because you use that as an analogy. Now, the interesting thing is that, again, like I said, humans are predictably irrational. You can predict that irrationality. And hence, because of that, you can actually research the root causes of those behaviors. You can run experiments and see whether how you nudge this behavior or that behavior, whether it changes those behaviors. And you can also build a database of those information and use that in other circumstances for you to decide on the right policy choices. For example, if I've seen a research in, let's say, vaccination, um, how you nudge people to get vaccinated in another country, I can see how people have behaviors against it. I can use the same information for me to inform policy choices in Malaysia. You can actually do that. So that's the interesting thing about this irrationality. It's actually systematic and predictable. One thing I wanted to touch on is this. And don't get me wrong. Don't think that this irrationality, that means that humans are uneducated or people are uneducated. We need to educate them, and so they'll be more rational. That is not the case. Humans have this way of maybe like if you compare with computers, for instance. In the past, computers cannot match with humans until they introduce fuzzy logic. When computers have fuzzy logic, they begin to have artificial intelligence. That is why then only a computer can compete with a human, because humans have a way to then have a mental shortcut and come to a decision. It's also called, in Malcolm Gladwell's book, he also says that it's thin slicing. Thin slicing, that means we can slice a thought in a very thin way that we can then find a quick answer to something very easily. We look at something, we see it's not right. We don't know what it is. We don't have to measure, but we know it's not right. So that is the power of human thinking. Don't think of it as something negative. Think of it as something positive. But we as policymakers should understand and adapt to it and make our policies take into account those human behaviors. So if you look on the right, you'll see some of the things I mentioned that people have limited attention spans, people struggle with their willpower, etc. I think you probably have noticed those are normal human traits, right? But again, limited attention span doesn't mean it is bad, because this is why humans are able to multitask, in their brains. They can juggle many things. Yesterday is International Women's Day, and some people I've heard in some of the dialogue, they say that, oh, women are better at multitasking. They can take care of many things at the same time. Right? Just an anecdote. Or they are people are attached to their identity on the social behavior they are in. So if people are from a certain community, they identify with people of the same who are like them, who look like them, who behave like them. We need to understand that. So it's important to consider the human thought process and avoid these kinds of bottlenecks, the things that you see on the right there, which then makes policy become costly or difficult to implement, or in fact fail if you don't take that into account. So I talked a lot about these behaviors and all that, right? Now, and I talk about how the economic thinking has changed. In fact, it has evolved, because now new economic theory considers heavily the human behavior. And we as policymakers need to also consider the human behavior. Starting from in the 70s, Herbert Simon defined rationality as being bounded, and how people, they satisfy, they provide answers that satisfy and suffice, right, which is called satisfying. I forgot the name, but never mind. And then Daniel Kahneman, he introduced the concept of fast and slow thinking. Humans have fast and slow thinking, or system one thinking, or system two thinking. And that is actually a good trait of human beings. And I mentioned here prospect theory and anchoring bias. I'm going to touch on that a little bit later on. And some of you who are familiar with behavioral insights may have heard of the nudge theory, which Richard Taylor introduced. And again, the predictable irrationality. And as recent as 2019, Nobel Prize winners had looked at behavior intervention in development economics. This is where, when you consider the poor people in development economics, means you look at the situation of developing countries, right? For poor people, behavioral intervention is a little different from us, because, for instance, if we have, coming back to the economic policy tools, if we put the pricing right, or the right information or incentives, sometimes you don't get the responses among the bottom 40. It's because their values are slightly different. Right? So they may not respond to the pricing the same way. It's not to say that the pricing is wrong. It's because maybe, for example, if you are very concerned about where you get the next meal, for instance, kais pagi makan pagi, kais petang makan petang, for example, right? So maybe then your priorities are different. So it is important to know, to understand. Okay, so it is a field that is more and more evolving, but this is a serious field. And these economists have been given the Nobel Prize for their groundbreaking work. Now, I mentioned a lot of behavioral insight theories and tools. There's so many of them. I won't go through all of this. It's that's another session I've explained in others webinars that I've done with MPC, and there are other experts who's going to share with you some of these theories and tools. But the point is that these are all typical human behaviors, and it's consistent anywhere around the world. For example, if let's look at one, let's say confirmation bias. That is where people seek out the same information that supports what they already believe. Like in Facebook, you go to something that confirms what you already think. So that confirmation bias is a behavior. It's the same anywhere, whether in Malaysia or in the US, the bias is the same. But of course, the information that you seek out is different. They may look at the things they like. You will look at the things that you like. But that bias, that behavior is the same. Let's say maybe I look at another one. Let's say diffuse responsibility. People act irresponsibly when they cannot be identified or where they are in a crowd. So right? When in a crowd, right, people don't follow SOP, right? Maybe they just throw rubbish anywhere because they cannot be identified. So that is the same behavior anywhere and everywhere to different degrees. So if we understand that, we then adjust our policies accordingly. So I'm going to go on to another example. So some of you may be able to guess where this picture is at. Quite easy to guess, right? It is in Kampung Baru. Eh? So now my question to you, is this an economic issue of supply and demand? Or is there something more to it? Supply and demand means that, is it the case where the person who owns the property cannot find a buyer who is willing to pay the price, and it is a supply and demand issue, or a buyer is not willing to buy the price because of economic issue? Yes, it is an economic issue based on supply and demand, but there's an underlying behavior behind that, and that is the endowment effect. Because people who own something always perceive it of higher value than what other people perceive it. Also, when you compare, let's say, in other locations, right, property will always find its market value. Then there's always a buyer. Then you can develop, you set a price, and then the buyer can then have enough of a margin that they can make money from it, sell to the market. So there's always a market value to something. So the transaction goes, quite smoothly in many, many locations. But in Kampung Baru, for instance, there is a very big mismatch. Now, is it really just a simple supply and demand issue, or is that an endowment effect? So maybe I explain a bit more about endowment effect. Though sometimes you might find that if you have something, you always value it as something more valuable than what others see it. You think it's more special. So, for instance, if I can see, like, some people, they will post pictures of their cat, for instance, and they value their cat. Sometimes people buy and sell cats, right? Much more than what other people value. They think it's more special than what other people think. It is a normal human trait. This is the endowment effect. So sometimes what happens is that even though you don't really work hard to obtain that thing, but you happen to find it, uh, or you happen to be given the thing. Research has shown that even though you have just only found the thing, you value it as higher than what other people value it. So would people buy it for the same value? Maybe not, but you think that it's a high value. So anyway, this is a behavioral issue, which I think as policymakers, if we want to look at solving some of these policy problems like development in Kampung Baru, for instance, we need to then understand the behaviors and then find ways to nudge those behaviors along. Okay. Now, because we put it in the context of economics, I thought I'd share with you, this is like an economic graph. Don't worry so much about the chart on the right. But what I want to draw your attention to is that you can see the blue line, okay, is like going up and then it taper off, right? And then the red line, it goes very deep now. So the blue line is where, you gain something, okay? So you gain something, you're very happy, and then you gain a bit more. Let's say you gain 100 ringgit, okay, you're happy. Then your next 100 ringgit, happy, but a bit less happy. Third 100 ringgit, not so important anymore. That's why the blue line is like that. But when you lose, right, it hurts so much more when you lose. That's why in people who invest, right, in let's say stock market, right, when you gain, okay, you're happy, but after a while you forget. But you lose, you will remember for a long time. That is because this, our utility is different. We hate losing much more than it's not a straight line. So we need to understand. So pricing, when you set the price, it is not a straight line. Don't assume that you set the price higher, people respond the same way, or you set the price low, people respond the same way. So let's say you're given 100, you're at the point of A, happiness, you lose 100, wow, you're at the point of B, so much more down, you feel so much more down. But let's say now, okay, I give you 200, and then I take back 100. So actually you still gain 100, right? You should be up, right? You should be happy. No, actually you are down. Because why? You have a new reference point, and this is called anchoring. People make comparisons, again, a chosen reference point, even though the conditions are different. So now, because I give you 200, you already think about your happiness at C. And then when I take it, it goes down to take 100. You still got 100 left. You're down at D. So don't worry about the details. The thing is that, the point that I want to make is about anchoring. When you give somebody something, I think maybe you will remember children are like that. You give them something, and when you take it away, right, they've already anchored to what you had given before. So now when you take it away, they really are not happy. Right? So that is a human behavior. Yeah? So now, we looked a bit about behaviors. I won't go too detailed into behaviors. That's for another seminar where we look into all the different behavioral insights, issues, and examples, and all that. But I just hope to share with you a little bit about policy making, and then now I want to touch about why we should then nudge these behaviors. So when you think about it, when you have a behavioral change, actually it's good for policies then to become complied with and to be adopted. It doesn't become so, you don't need so much regulation to make those policies become accepted. And you don't have to do so much enforcement because people willingly adopt. I'll give you an example. Before now the vaccines are being rolled out, right? But for about a year, we didn't have any vaccines. So how do we manage a pandemic? It's actually behavioral change. Things like wearing masks, washing hands, social distancing are all behavioral change. Okay, you can still have SOP, right? You must have SOP, and you have fines if you break the SOP. That is true. But just imagine the enforcement of the SOP will cost a lot. You'll have to set up roadblocks everywhere. You'll have to have checks everywhere. Right? But if people behave according to willingly they behave, it is better. So, for example, I think some of you may be aware in the US, for instance, a lot of people, because of maybe Trump, right? He says, don't wear masks, right? So people don't want to wear masks. So that behavior did not change in America, and hence, when you look at the graph, the cases of the COVID was really escalated very high. Uh, and also, these nudges are actually rather inexpensive because sometimes you don't really have to give people incentive. It's not like government giving incentives, cash incentives to do something or imposing penalties. Sometimes some of these nudges are just like things like reminders, you know, um, and notification, things like that, and something that a social network, because people behave that way, you follow the way. So it doesn't cost a lot, and of course it is consistent with giving people a good choice. Don't want to force things upon people. And the best thing is that it's quite easy to introduce these nudges, and then if you're done with it, it's quite easy to disband it because you're not really changing anything. So for policymakers, when you introduce policy, it has a regulation behind it, it has penalties behind it, but also think about the behavioral nudges that you can introduce. They're not very expensive, they're not very complicated, it can be done. Many governments around the world, in many their respective ministries, have introduced behavioral insight units to look at it. So, and we are very happy that NPC is spearheading this effort in Malaysia as well. And the intention is that in Malaysia, many of the ministries will then also adopt behavioral insight when they roll out their respective policies. Now, so I thought I'd look at a case study of a policy that is recently introduced. This is the latest budget. This is a hot button issue, which is smoking and tobacco, for instance. So as you can see, a lot of the regulation that happened, that were introduced in the budget, the benefit of that to the policymaker is that there is tax revenue. It contributes to gross national income. That is a good thing. But as you can see, there's a lot of regulation that is introduced. And these regulations have administration costs and enforcement costs. So, which is, it's not to say that, it is not good. It is good that you have this. But what about the behavioral change for the smokers? How do you change the behaviors of the smokers? Yes, you can introduce taxes, but let's look at the statistics. Over the years, you can see that although the revenue and the tax rate has increased, the revenue, the collection to the government has increased, which is good. But the alternative is the contraband cigarette. So in the earlier slide, I showed that one of the initiatives is to also tighten the control of importation of illegal cigarettes. So that is good, but that is a costly activity, very costly activity. And if you look in the third chart here, you can see the percentage increase of illegal cigarettes available in Malaysia has actually gone up over the years. So although you tighten, it has gone up. So now, yes, we have a policy. We will tighten it even more, but time will tell whether that policy will work. And although the retail price of cigarettes have gone up because of the taxes, in terms of the consumption, it has not really gone down. So this is a policy that over many years, we have not really found a good solution. Taxation doesn't always work. Enforcement is also very costly and difficult to do. So maybe it is time to look at what behavioral interventions you can introduce. So, for example, in a concurrent panel going on right now in this very same webinar, MPC together with the Ministry of Health is doing a sort of a case study to look at uh, secondhand smoke. People, family members who are exposed to secondhand smoke, can they then nudge the smokers within their family away from smoking? So we need to look at behavioral change for smokers. So, for example, in the case of healthcare, let's say diabetes, for instance, yes, you can treat diabetes. There's a big cost to the government for dialysis care and everything, but where the solutions start is behavioral change. That means you consume less unhealthy food like sugar and all that, teh tarik. So in the same way, for smoking as well, you should look at behavioral change. And there's already things like, personal health coaching or virtual health. Now you use technology like even the Apple Watch can also measure your blood oxygen level, etc. So what I'm saying is, it actually does not cost as much as the enforcement to introduce this behavioral change. It is a new area. It might be a bit complicated how to apply it, but actually it is a lot cheaper to apply, and it may be more effective. So as policymakers, we should think about how we can nudge those behaviors to a good direction. Now, so having said all that, these are my last few sets of slides before we open up to questions. Now, think of it this way. Behavioral insights really are based on research, so don't assume that people are just not compliant because they are, lazy, or, they don't have knowledge. It's not because of that, because, we didn't take into account these behaviors. So we can do a bit of research on the behavior of these users and the context where this policy operates in. We can also do a bit of research on the policy delivery team. What I mean is that implementing agency, how far they have gone. So, for example, and let's say in terms of education, you go down the line to the last mile. Who are the ones that deliver those policies, right? To the front line, for the people who get the education, which are, of course, starting with the ministry, then it goes to the district education, state education office, and the district education office, etc., right? And down to the respective schools and down to respective teachers, right? You can actually do a bit of research on that. And behavioral insights require a bit of experimentation. So you can do a bit of research and test it on the ground and see what works. And if it's good, you can expand it further. Look at it that way. And behavioral insights, again, like I mentioned, is similar or consistent or predictable. So it's evidence-based. You can document those results, and even the unsuccessful interventions also you can document. Where the policy has failed, also you can document that for the purpose of knowledge. And then you can look at international examples, how they roll out certain things. For instance, now I think the government is concerned, and in fact the population is also concerned about how do we get 80% of the population vaccinated, right? So now we need that solution. But there has already been research on vaccination in other countries, not on COVID, but on flu vaccination or polio vaccination. In the old days, it's very easy. You just have laws, and then you introduce polio vaccination in the school. It's very effective. But there, just now I mentioned that development economic, they had also looked at vaccination in Madagascar and India. Why those communities they don't want to be vaccinated, and what are the nudges that were introduced in those countries that encourage people to get vaccinated. It's actually very simple interventions. So my point is this: these are evidence from other countries. We can apply it. We also, within the various ministries or implementing agencies, we can also look at examples and share that information. And this is what MPC is also doing. They have developed a few case studies, and that case study will form the body of knowledge which will inform other policymakers. So I mentioned MPC had already done all that. MPC has also developed a framework for how policymakers can introduce behavioral insights. It's called the PRIME framework, based on the acronym PRIME. There's something behind it, lah. So later, when MPC launches this PRIME framework, you'll get to know a bit more about it. And as policymakers, you can try to adopt it within your various units in government. So think of behavioral insights as really a policy tool. Earlier, if you remember the first few slides, we talked about the policy tool of price, incentives and penalties, and information. Behavioral insight is also a policy tool in addition to all of the above. So if you use it, it will help to drive the success of these policies. Consider behavioral insights as also a diagnostic kit. Diagnostic means that you can you can diagnose its policy issues and behavior and align it with the goals, and look at it as a way for you to diagnose how people respond to various policies and get a sense of the population's behaviors and what are their priorities and values. And again, like I already mentioned, a database of evidence, because behaviors are systematic. You can compare and exchange information between policymakers around the world. So thank you very much. And I come to the end of my presentation, and over to you, and I welcome questions.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Eddie, for a very interesting, and I think not only is interesting, but I guess it will require a lot of thinking from the policymakers in terms of implementing the policy itself. And before implement the policy, you have to take into account the behavior of the human, and that would determine how well does the policy works when you imply that to the public. So that's a very, very good topic, and all those points that are given. And what I like is that, Mr. Eddie, you integrate those economics as well as the social part, where now I think not just Malaysia, but other countries as well, we are moving towards integrating from all aspects, not just in terms of the economics, the benefits of the economics, but on the social level, on the environment, sustainable, those kind of things. So I think that would make our country produce more relevant, more implementation kind of policies to the public. So talking also about unpredictable human behavior, I'm sure out there we have unpredictable questions from our audience as well. So I'm going to let our audience, if you have any questions, burning questions that you want to ask Mr. Eddie about our topic today, how we nudge behaviors in terms of putting in the right policy, you can either put into the chat box, or even this recording is live on Facebook, so that you can also type the questions in the chat box there. All right, thank you very much.